Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Johannes Urpelainen, and I am the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy Resources and Environment and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP, at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Jonas Nahm from the Energy Resources and Environment Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS to tell us about globalization, climate change, and clean tech supply chains in the age of COVID-19. This is a webinar organized by the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy and the Energy Resources Network Program. I put in the chat window the websites for our program, so if you want to learn more about our research, upcoming events, study opportunities, and other content, please do check out those websites. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there for everybody to explore. Now, for today's webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to have Jonas give a presentation on some of his research and thinking on these issues. And then after that, we are going to take questions. At any given time, if you have a question that comes to your mind, you can use the Q&A function to ask the question. And then I will moderate the discussion. I will take those questions. I'll direct them to Jonas. If it's something clarifying, I might do it during the presentation. If not, then we will have the discussion after Jonas is done with his presentation. And this will be a recorded presentation, so it will be available to everybody in case you have any connection problem or some such during the webinar. And with that, Professor Nahm, why don't you get us started on the presentation?
Thanks, Johannes. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. So, you know, obviously this is sort of an early stage of thinking about these issues, and we're sort of still in the middle of the pandemic. But Johannes asked me a few weeks ago to think a little bit about what this might mean for climate change and the recovery after the pandemic. So I've been thinking a little bit about sort of broader issues and also how my own research relates to some of these questions. I was in China in January, actually, on a research trip looking at electric vehicle manufacturing firms. And at the time, mid-January in Shanghai, dinner with a bunch of journalists, people were still saying there is no human-to-human transmission. I think I left China on the 18th or 19th of January, sort of with the grand exodus of expats who were all going away for the Chinese New Year holiday. And I spent some time in Japan. By the time I got to the States, Wuhan was shut down. The situation had changed completely. And it turned out China wasn't coming back from the Chinese New Year holiday in the way that was anticipated. And so immediately we saw a lot of reporting coming out about the impact of the economic shutdown in China at the time. And so basically what we saw is sort of a usual calming down of the Chinese economy during the Chinese New Year holiday, and then the sort of failure to rebound afterwards. So across a range of indicators, we basically saw sort of a very quiet time because of the shutdown as a result of the virus. And so immediately there was a lot of reporting about what this meant for the environment. And so what we saw very visibly on satellite imaging at the time was a kind of a rapid reduction in NOx levels across China. Particulate emissions went down, so the air pollution crisis was suddenly solved. Estimates were that China was producing 25% less carbon emissions at the time, immediately following the holiday. And so suddenly there was a lot of reporting about the unintended environmental benefits of the COVID recession in the media. And so thinking about this topic for today, I wanted to make sort of three slightly pessimistic or maybe very pessimistic claims about this. And especially the third one is one that's very close to my research, but I'm using the first two to sort of frame the debate. And I think many of you have probably seen reporting on this to sort of share these ideas. And so what I really want to argue is that there is no silver lining in the COVID crisis, and that it doesn't get us around some of the hard politics and trying to figure out a solution to the climate crisis. And so I'll try to frame this in three facts. And the first fact really is that the emissions reductions are temporary and they're much smaller than you think. The second fact is that the stimulus, and so we've already started passing stimulus bills around the world, but looking at past recessions, the climate share of stimulus spending is likely going to be very small and probably too small to really make the impact that we need in order to fix the climate problem in the time that we have left to do so. And the third fact is that COVID has already started undermining globalization. There's a lot of pushback on international economic integration. And what I want to share in the third part of the presentation is really an argument that that's bad for emissions and that we need collaboration, and especially collaboration with China to make a meaningful impact on climate. And so the first fact really is that these reductions are temporary and they're much smaller than you think. If you look at past emissions reductions during economic crises, they've all been temporary. And so if the past is any guide, we're going to bounce back from these current emissions reductions very quickly. Every recession has been followed by a post-crisis sort of emissions spike. There have been really no long-term sustainable changes to a global emissions curve from economic crises. And so I don't think this one is going to be any different. The current reductions are also not really buying as much time. They're relatively small in relation to the overall challenge. Estimates really vary, and we're still in the middle of the economic crisis, so it's unclear how long this is going to last. But most people sort of estimate that it's going to be less than 5% emissions drop for 2020. So this is not an overall drop. And so that might sound like a lot, 5%, but if you look at this in terms of the existing emissions context, how much we've already put into the atmosphere, this is a very, very small part. And so the Breakthrough Institute had this lovely slide sort of outlining what 5% really looks like. And if you look at this in terms of the global emissions impact, a 5% reduction really is not very meaningful and unlikely to have much impact. I also think that there is a sort of political downside to framing climate policy in this particular way at this time. I think we've all worked in this field very hard for a long time to disassociate economic crises and climate change. We've been trying to say that it's possible and trying to show that it's possible to both have healthy economies and reduce carbon emissions. And so I worry sometimes, just sort of personally in this, and watching the reporting on this, that if we argue that these major, terrible, drastic economic recessions are necessary or helpful even for reducing emissions, we're sort of not doing ourselves a great service. So we can have growing, healthy economies and emissions reductions. And so we need to sort of make sure that we don't frame the problem in this particular way. The second fact really is that the green stimulus share will likely be too small. There's been a second approach to sort of thinking about the COVID recession through the climate lens that's really focused on the potential stimulus packages. And so indeed, maybe there is a golden opportunity here to create growth through investment in carbon emissions reductions. During past recessions, emissions investments have often created more jobs than investments in just cars, roads, and sort of generic infrastructure. That certainly was the case in the great financial crisis in 2010. And already governments are talking about including climate-related spending in their emissions, in their stimulus packages in the post-COVID recovery. So Germany has announced that it's working on a green stimulus bill to the tune of about 100 billion euro. There are 10 nations in the European Union that are pushing the European Commission to do something similar. There's a big faction in the European Parliament that's also doing the same. And so there is an opportunity here to think about, if we're going to have a lot of government investment in the economy to recover, how can we direct that investment in a way that helps us grow the economy by also investing in long-term emissions reductions. And so these can be things like public transit, infrastructure projects that really change the way that we use energy. These can be investments in renewable energy. And so there's a lot of opportunity, building efficiency, a lot of opportunity to spend money and do so in ways that will help us wean ourselves off fossil fuels. But if we look at past financial crises and economic crises and the kinds of money that we've spent afterwards and sort of climbing out of it, I don't see much evidence that there's going to be an overwhelming climate push. In preparation for this, I dug up some of the studies that HSBC did and CSIS did in the post-Great Financial Crisis recovery. And if you look at the share spent on green project, it really wasn't very large. The highest estimates I could find was 16% of stimulus spending globally, and energy investments for sort of accounting for about 11%. The US was below 10%, so about 800 billion committed under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and 80 billion of that were committed to green investments. But these were numbers based on top line spending. And so the actual percentage of green stimulus was closer to 5% because actual spending exceeded what we anticipated. And so if the financial crisis is really any guide, the stimulus impact on climate is unlikely to be large. And it's unlikely to really push the needle toward aggressive climate action in the time frame that we have to really start reducing emissions. Meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement will require net zero emissions by 2050 and really quite rapid reductions before then. We've already lost 10 years since the last financial crisis. And so our need for rapid action is really greater than it was before. And so say the US spends about 4 trillion on economic recovery, 2 trillion were already committed in the first bill. 5% spending is about 200 billion. Converting the US power grid to 100% zero carbon sources is estimated to cost somewhere between 60 and 80 trillion dollars. 200 billion would basically just about pay for a seawall to protect New York City from sea level rise. And so the temptation, so the stimulus package is unlikely to be too small, and at the same time, there's already a temptation to spend much of the money on carbon emitters. That was the case in 2010 when we had a very progressive administration in the US in charge. China right now has shelved much coal investment that could quickly be activated to spur growth and employment. So there's sort of a danger in China to equate economic growth with spending on not just on clean stuff, but also on sources of energy that are going to make the emissions problem worse. You've seen airlines asking for carbon taxes to be paused. The German car makers are currently pushing back on climate targets and asking the European Union to delay the implementation of certain kinds of emissions regulations. We've seen a similar push in the United States. Here in the first stimulus bill, airlines and also the oil sector were stimulus targets. Some attempts by the Democrats to ask for certain environmental standards as a result of bailing out airlines were rejected, so we didn't really make much progress. And so if we've already spent half of our stimulus money in the US in this first bill, I don't really see how there's going to be this sort of overwhelming push toward emission reduction as a result of stimulus spending here and elsewhere. And so that doesn't mean that there can't be much good that comes out of stimulus spending, and we can still make a difference and use the money in ways that really help us shift the economy away in the long term. But it's going to be a fairly small shift, in my opinion, based on the last recession and based on sort of how the current politics are playing out. The maybe less obvious, and I think in many ways most interesting and also most dangerous and long-term consequence that I see of the COVID situation at the moment is that COVID is really undermining global economic integration. And I think that's bad for our prospects for emissions reductions for a number of reasons. Henry Farrell and Abe Newman published a great piece that I would encourage everyone to read in the Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago that sort of stated that coronavirus is ending or might end globalization as we know it, and talked a lot about the sort of market vulnerabilities that the pandemic exposed that we hadn't really anticipated before. And the main thesis in their argument is that globalization has essentially been a long process of specialization and a really global division of labor, and a system that's now shown to be extremely vulnerable to disruption as economies have shut down, governments have fought over medical suppliers that have produced medical supplies thousands of miles away from them. And governments around the world have both tried to divert shipments and sort of, essentially competed for supplies in this very specialized global supply chains, and have, as a result, begun to question their nation's exposure to this vulnerability stemming from globalization. I think in the United States, certainly, and elsewhere, they've begun pushing for some degree of reshoring, for national self-sufficiency. And there's also been a pretty hefty backlash against reliance on China, in particular in the United States. And these developments, I don't think, are new, especially in Washington. There's been much talk in recent months and years about the need to decouple from the Chinese economy, the need to roll back globalization, to reshore manufacturing in the US economy. And so in many ways, this has been a bipartisan debate in the US about US-China relations, and the COVID crisis has in many ways only exacerbated these sentiments in the US. And so I share the concern of Henry Farrell and Abe Newman about these new approaches to globalization, or sort of these exacerbated approaches to globalization. And what I want to do here is sort of show that I think they're bad for emissions for two particular reasons. And first, I worry that this anti-globalization sentiment stemming from the COVID experience will in the long term exacerbate what I call the manufacturing trap in green industrial policy making and in climate politics more broadly. This will likely make stimulus spending less efficient and give us less bang for our buck as we recover from the current economic downturn. And the second argument is that this anti-China sentiment in particular is destructive for the kinds of collaboration we need to quickly and affordably reduce emissions. We have very little time to do so, and currently China is key to producing many of the technologies that we need to do this. And so I worry that the sort of combination of economic nationalism and anti-China sentiment in the current COVID crisis, particularly in the United States, are going to be destructive. I think some of you may have heard me talk about these issues in the past. I think I've had shared similar concerns when we were debating the Green New Deal and other green industrial policy projects, but I'll repeat them here because I think they're particularly important in the current situation. And so there are really sort of two aspects to it. So let's talk about the manufacturing trap first. There's always been a sort of political logic behind green industrial policy, and I expect that to be the same in the kinds of policy making we need in the stimulus to include green spending. And so climate policy requires a lot of fiscal and regulatory resources to incentivize the kind of change, economic and behavioral change. It requires a lot of money to offset costs of switching to new energy sources and to compensate losers. And so that dynamic I expect to be exactly the same in the green stimulus context. What we've done historically as a result of this is we've promised local economic benefits as a result of such spending, and much of this benefit promise has focused on manufacturing jobs, particularly in the US. I think there's a unique political status of manufacturing jobs, and so we've often combined tax money, tax spending essentially on green projects with promises of creating local manufacturing benefits. And so as a result of that, we've seen a proliferation of protectionism in clean energy policy. Joanna Lewis at Georgetown has done great work on that, documenting this over time. We've seen trade barriers, we've seen sort of a proliferation of local content rules. And so trying to spend money on green stuff has led to a sort of kind of a pushback against global trade ties, essentially. And so as a result, we've seen a lot of conflict over green industrial policy. In the US, there's a sort of a great survey article from 2015 that looks at state programs for renewable energy in particular, and many of them have used local content requirements to either only give subsidies for or include them in renewable portfolio standards when they've used locally manufactured equipment, locally generated electricity, and so on. Internationally, we've seen countervailing duty and anti-dumping disputes. And so the question is, how can we avoid this kind of manufacturing trap in the post-COVID stimulus package? Because we currently don't have this kind of manufacturing infrastructure in many parts of the world. And what we do have is a share of very complex global supply chains that require international collaboration. If we think about the time frame that we have in order to get to net zero emissions by 2050, I just don't think that we have the time to build up these supply chains in national context in this particular way. And so I worry that the sort of sentiment coming out of the COVID debate, the pushback against globalization and the sort of perceived vulnerability of this international division of labor will lead us to attempt to try to do this, which will delay our climate response. And so I think the spending, the green spending that might come with the recovery package might have this unintended consequence that will have pretty negative effects on the timeline for climate. I also think that fixing the climate crisis will require collaboration with China. And again, I think that the current sort of political sentiment coming from the experience that we're going through right now is not helpful for pushing for this kind of collaboration. I think many of you are aware of this, but China currently still produces about 2/3 of the world's solar panels and makes over 1/3 of the world's wind turbines, and a much larger share of the components that go into wind turbines everywhere, not just in China. It's by far the largest supplier and market for electric vehicles. China makes a huge chunk of the world's lithium-ion batteries, which we all need for electric vehicles, but also for on-grid storage and many other applications that that will come with a shift to more renewable energy. And so China has really built up a huge industrial base around the kinds of technologies that we need to combat the climate crisis. Much of my own research has been looking at what China's contribution has been in these industries. And one argument that I want to make is that China's not just contributed manufacturing scale, but it's really invented scale production in these industries. Before Chinese firms entered wind and solar sectors, these were small kind of cottage industries in most parts of the world. And so the sort of scale up to mass production was really a Chinese invention in many ways. And it wasn't just a solely Chinese industry. Chinese manufacturers worked with American startups and with European producers of production equipment and so on to bring these economies to scale, but they really contributed a particular type of innovation to these collaborations. And that was the kind of focus on how do you take these technologies and bring them to mass production very, very quickly. And we're currently seeing a similar kind of division of labor emerging in the battery space, where China is also really pushing cost, scale, and speed in the production of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles in particular. And so this kind of system relies exactly on the kind of global division of labor that Henry Farrell and Abe Newman have said is very vulnerable in this current state. But if we move away from that kind of division of labor, I really think that we're risking starting from scratch, and we don't have time to start from scratch. So in the sort of foreseeable future, China is going to be key in supplying us with many of the technologies through these collaborations that we need to reduce emissions quickly and sort of to the tune that we need in order to meet these kinds of targets. China, as a result of this innovation and scale and cost, has also been a key factor in the affordability of these technologies. If you look at the price of solar and wind technologies, they've dropped dramatically over the past decade or so. And a lot of that has had to do with innovation and investment in manufacturing in Chinese factories for solar in particular, but also for wind. And so pulling away from this division of labor and kind of trying to replicate national systems of national supply chains in these industries as a result of the kinds of tax spending that we'll have to do to shore up green investment in the recovery period would threaten these cost advantages, and it would really set us back, I think, quite a lot, not just in terms of time, but also in what it costs to make these kinds of shifts away from fossil fuel. And so if you talk to any kind of solar developer in the US about China, they will tell you that the tariffs that we've placed on the imports of Chinese panels have made their life more difficult and have made it more expensive to build solar in the US. So again, I think we can spend on a green recovery, but I hope that we spend on a green recovery focusing on service sector jobs and not trying to replicate manufacturing, because that's going to take a long time and may not pay off in terms of jobs. And I hope that we can spend on a green recovery by working with China on figuring out how to do this, because that's going to make it cheaper and faster for us to get these economies of scale in investment in wind and solar and other technologies. And so I think batteries is probably the obvious next one. So if I think about sort of COVID-19 and climate in these early days and thinking about what a stimulus package and the sort of recovery could look like, I think there's sort of 3 early lessons, and I'm sounding very authoritative. They're really early lessons, and so I think things might change. But I'm hopeful that they might change and be less pessimistic than I lay them out here. But I think the first one really is that current emissions reductions just demonstrate the scale of the climate challenge. We've basically shut down the world economy. We've stopped flying, we've stopped driving in our cars, and we've had a minuscule impact on sort of overall global emissions in that time, if we look at them in the real context. And so we need to get very smart at trying to figure out new ways of doing that. Just shutting things down is certainly not the solution, but it just sort of shows you how drastic the action will have to be going forward if we want to have a real impact. I think the second lesson is that the green stimulus is an opportunity, but it won't get us around the hard politics of trying to figure out how much to spend and where to spend it, and how to fight back against those that are lobbying for bailouts for big emitters. And so, I think it is an opportunity, but we need to make sure that we attach emissions standards to the kinds of spending that we do, that we make sure that if airlines get a bailout, they commit to climate targets and so on. So I think that's something that we can do. It won't be enough, but even what we can do is going to involve really hard political fights in order for us to be successful. And I think the third lesson and the one that I think is particularly challenging in this current sort of political climate is that if we have any hope of kind of preventing the worst consequences of climate change and getting to net zero emissions in the time frame that we have, we really need to find a way to work with China, and that involves focusing on what we can bring to the table and what they can bring to the table, and how we can work together on getting technologies to market quickly and deploying them around the world. But that can't mean a sort of mercantilist trade policy, a focus on kind of national advantage, and a kind of decoupling from this division of labor that might be fragile and look fragile in the current global economic climate, but it's the only division of labor that we have for these technologies, and we don't have time to figure out a new one. That doesn't mean that this division of labor is fixed. I think there might be different ways of doing this in the future for different technologies, but for the stuff that's ready to go today, this is what we have. And so if we want to spend money on making progress now, I think this is what we need to work with. And I think with that, I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a discussion and make this more of a conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonas, for a very insightful and at times provocative presentation. I'm going to take these questions in a somewhat selective manner, starting with just some very simple clarifying questions and then moving into the kind of broader discussion. So the first one is Alex Wright is asking here, did I understand Jonas to say converting the power grid to green tech in the US will cost between 60 and 80 trillion dollars? Is that correct, or?
These are sort of models that I pulled up. There's a huge debate about how to even do that, and I don't want to wade into this sort of 80% versus 100% renewables debate either. But these are just some estimates that are floating around. I think it's really hard to tell. I think what I do know from this is that we're kind of orders of magnitude away of even approximating this kind of spending, and so I think that's really the important lesson to take away here.
Perfect, thank you. Another question among sort of similar lines is a number of people have asked about the comparison between the global financial crisis in 2008 and what we are facing right now. So do you think things are different this time, given that there is more sort of interest in climate change, not necessarily in the United States, but sort of Europe and Asia? Do you think the comparison is fair, or do you think things might play out differently this time?
I think that there's a couple of forces that are pushing in an opposite direction. I think there's much more concern about climate change globally at the moment than there was 10 years ago. So maybe there's an opportunity for more aggressive politics at this point, maybe not in the US, but maybe elsewhere. I also think that there is maybe a recognition in the US, at least among some parts of the US population, that sort of believing in science actually is a pretty useful thing. I mean, sort of ignoring the warnings about the pandemic that have been around for a long time and sort of the need to prepare for one might also give us some faith in the sort of recommendations of scientists about what to do about climate change and what will happen if we don't act, because we're currently seeing what happens if we don't act. But I also think we've lost 10 years, essentially, at least in the US, we've lost 10 years. We haven't really made huge progress, right? And so we're currently rolling back some of the progress. And so while there might be more willingness to act and maybe more awareness, we also have to be much more aggressive now because we've lost so much time. And so I think that's kind of pulling in the opposite direction. So I think those would be my kind of ways of comparing the experience. In terms of the sort of economic damage and the need to recover, it seems like this is going to be much worse. There'll be much more money spent. Maybe this is finally a move away from sort of this austerity idea that the Europeans have sort of held dear for a long time. And so maybe this is an opportunity to do more, but I think we also now have to do a lot more quickly on the climate front in order to do something about this.
Excellent, thank you, Jonas. So let me next follow with some questions here related again to the stimulus. And so one of the attendees is asking, if you think of the stimulus bill, what should we have in a stimulus bill? Like, what would be your wish list if you could in the United States? Let's pretend for a while that we have a different president and all that. What would you like to see in a stimulus bill?
Yeah, I mentioned some of the things earlier. I mean, transportation, for instance, has been like a rapidly growing share of the US emissions sort of bill. And so I think this is really an opportunity to push vehicle electrification. The technology is now ready, car manufacturers are ready, but the US just rolled back or is pushing back against emission standards for cars, right? And loosened them. So I think that would be one thing. I mean, kind of a cash for clunkers program that could really push zero carbon transportation. I also think that this is an opportunity to invest in building efficiency, for instance. I mean, if you think about long-term investments that create local jobs that can't be offshored, construction would be, a great way of doing that. So I think there's a couple of these measures that are not particularly creative or new. I think it's just the scale will have to be different this time in order to do that. What I was warning about is the kind of, let's push for renewable energy investment, but then make it contingent on these things being produced in the United States. Let's not have a cash for clunkers program that only that requires cars to be manufactured here. I think we need to focus on the emissions impact, and there's lots of jobs and services surrounding all of these industries that will be jobs in the United States. I think the sort of accounting of employment in that space is unhelpful, and it's going to cost us a lot of time.
Excellent. So next I have Tom Simchak-Mesera is pointing out that the tax stimulus was a very important part of promoting renewable energy in the 2009 stimulus program and more generally. Any thoughts on this kind of strategy, tax incentives and stimulus?
Yeah, there is already, I mean, there's sort of a debate in the US to extend the production tax credit and investment tax credit for renewable energy, for instance, at the moment. And that's exactly right. I think that was a big part back then. We are now trying to phase them out, or we've agreed to phase them out here. And so there might be a way to extend some of these things in order to make it attractive. I think the sort of solar development industry is trying to figure out what their business model is going to look like when these tax incentives go away. And so this might make it easy to do that. In general, though, the sort of, the way that we've done tax incentives for these industries has been particularly crazy in the US. And so, we've basically given tax credits to companies that often don't have a tax liability, which then has required this very complicated industry around it, where you have tax equity investors that come in and take a share. And so it's not been a very efficient system. So maybe this could be an opportunity not just to extend tax benefits, but also make them make them more accessible to the people who need them. And so maybe we should go back to giving out grants rather than tax credits as a result of this.
Jonas, just a warning, there's a very, very long list of questions. Obviously very happy to see this, but I'm going to try to go through as fast as possible. I need a little bit of your help here. So first, next I want to take a few questions related to China. There's a number of questions that are linked to each other. So for example, Harvey King is asked China's view. Do they see an opportunity here for clean tech? And Jane Nakano is asking if this COVID-19 induced slowdown might have an impact on China's industrial strategy in clean tech. So what do you think of this?
I think there are forces that are cutting in different directions in China, and it's a little bit unclear how it's going to play out. But the sort of economic uncertainty before COVID led to a number of statements from senior Chinese leadership that in this sort of current economic climate, there would be a pivot back to coal as a sort of reliable energy source for the domestic economy. And so those hardliners certainly were given support by the trade war. And so if this is sort of, many times worse and its impact on the Chinese economy, I would expect that the coal lobby is going to benefit from this. There's already some 100 gigawatt under construction, another 100 gigawatt plan. Some of them were shelved or sort of paused for a period of time. And so, the folks sort of advocating for that might benefit from this, which doesn't mean that the clean tech industry in China won't also get support. China's sort of been very comfortable both pushing coal and renewables for a long time now. But I certainly think that economic uncertainty always gives a sort of leg up to the ones who say that coal is reliable, it's been there for a long time, and it creates kind of local economic benefit.
Excellent. Next I have Dr. Joseph Nyangon is asking about what are the key sectors that are going to sort of help us with this economic rebound in the green economy? Where do you see opportunity and potential for economic growth in a sustainable way?
I mean, I think the technology is most ready for in the power sector. That's where, we can invest, but I think that sort of depends a little bit on the country. I mean, we're not going to see a lot of growth in power demand, and so this would be kind of a replacement of existing generation infrastructure, which is politically, of course, much more contentious. I think transportation is, is a real opportunity. In the past recessions, we've spent a lot on car company bailouts, but also incentives for people to buy new cars. If we could make those about green cars, that would make us, would sort of move us down the cost curve pretty radically. I think these sort of long-term investments like building efficiency is incredibly hard because it's so decentralized, it's so expensive. If we could figure out a way to do that, I think that would go such a long way because buildings last such a long time. They're such a big part of our energy consumption, and they create real jobs on the ground in a way that we need right now. And so I think that might be a big part of what we need to do.
Perfect. And next I have Alexander Stapleton is asking about kind of experiences from the private sector. Is there something in how firms have responded to the COVID that would give some insights into how to do the broader kind of green transformation or transition into a new economy? Have you seen anything kind of exciting and interesting out there so far?
I think that's a tough one. I mean, I feel like right now that everyone's just been scrambling and most places have shut down for the time being. So, outside of the sort of delivery business, I haven't really seen seen any kind of sustainable shifts just yet.
Got it.
I mean, one thing that we can talk about is sort of, are we going to be stuck with Zoom forever, right? Because we won't, I think it certainly will, I think the travel industry will probably take a hit in the long run. I don't think we'll stop traveling, but it's certainly now opened up new possibilities for meeting in ways that we hadn't considered previously or were kind of afraid to implement. So it's sort of, just kind of low-hanging fruit, but I think that's certainly the case.
Perfect. And next I have two questions on kind of alternatives to China. So let's assume that you're right, that there's going to be this sort of interest in reducing dependence on China's supply chains and manufacturing. What are the opportunities on the one hand for developing countries, let's say India, Southeast Asia, maybe Africa? This is a question from Arti Sundaram. And on the other hand, Martin Boucher is asking about other parts in the US. Are there some parts in manufacturing where there's opportunity in the United States?
Yes, and I think, so maybe the last question first. I think that there's, US firms have always participated in this industry and in this division of labor. For the longest time, we were the biggest supplier of silicon in the world. I mean, and with a big trade surplus to China in that particular space. So, there's always been opportunity. I think maybe there's been less opportunity in sort of the large scale manufacturing, but there's automation equipment, there's component, there's all sorts of like advanced materials that go into these things. And there's a lot of technology that's developed here that goes into these products, right? So those are all creating local economic benefits. I think for both the US and other countries, a big obstacle to building out this kind of manufacturing infrastructure has been financing. And so venture capital hasn't been particularly interested historically in sort of these multi-billion-dollar plans. Our banking system hasn't been particularly interested in financing these billion-dollar plans. And I think the same goes for many other developing economies. So if this might lead to kind of a renewed focus on manufacturing elsewhere in the world and sort of the need for national infrastructure banks to fund kind of green manufacturing initiatives, I think that would be great. I don't think we should stop competing with China, but I think we can compete with China and also work with China at the same time while we maybe build new capabilities of this type elsewhere. And so if stimulus spending will lead to kind of, green manufacturing lending around the world in places like India, I think that would be a good thing.
Wonderful. So next I have two people. I have Josh Cohen and Josephine Lingard asking about the EV supply chain. So do you think there's a risk to electric vehicles from COVID in terms of the supply chain that results in Teslas and all that?
I mean, I think most car manufacturing is stopped for now around the world. And so, it's not like we're sort of urgently trying to buy electric vehicles at the moment that we can't get. I think there's a few challenges though. So one is this sort of, if we don't fly anymore and if Americans are going to drive longer distances, if the road trip is coming back, I think there's a new range anxiety. I think that a lot of the manufacturers sort of thought with 300-mile ranges of the new cars coming out now, they had fixed most of that. And I've had some conversations over the last couple of weeks that might be kind of coming back, or that they're concerned that that's coming back. So sort of the problem of range, because we might be using cars differently. And then I think, of course, are people even buying cars? So like the sort of the turnover and the fleet might slow down. So that would set us back. And then this, what I already talked about, sort of nationalism, sort of mercantilist argument, we need to, for now, buy batteries from Chinese manufacturers, pretty much. And there's battery consortiums that are sort of sprouting up elsewhere in the world. Some of these battery manufacturers were planning to expand into the US, for instance, with manufacturing plants. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out, and it might make it complicated for a while.
Got it. Perfect. So next I have a few questions related to China. So Daljit Singh is asking about how would you sort of counteract some of these less desirable responses like anti-globalization, anti-China. And then on the other hand, I have some anonymous attendees asking, what do we do if we cannot cooperate with China? What if the collaboration just sort of breaks down? What are the alternatives? So if you could take these two questions at the same time.
In terms of, countering this anti-China and anti sort of globalization climate, I think, what I'm not advocating is not to have difficult conversations with China about trade practices and on, human rights, all sorts of stuff. I think there are many things that we can discuss. What we had in the past, and particularly under the Obama administration, was a sort of conversation with China about climate as an area of shared interest that then opened other ways of talking about more difficult things. So we used sort of the climate debate as a conduit for other more complicated issues. And maybe that's where we could go back to. I mean, this is an issue that affects us all. China has, many of the solutions, but not all of the solutions. So both highlighting what China brings to the table, how it can sort of improve relationships more broadly, but also how US firms and European firms are benefiting from China doing well in these areas. So this is a global system. And so if we hope that bankruptcies of Chinese solar manufacturers are going to help US solar manufacturers, we also have to be aware that they'll hurt companies like DuPont that are selling advanced materials to Chinese solar manufacturers. So I think these interdependencies are not really clear to a lot of people, and we can do a much better job of communicating how we're all in the same boat on many of these issues. Remind me of the other, there was one more.
Just
the alternative to, this doesn't work out, yes. I don't really see an alternative, to be honest. I mean, it's taken China 30 years to build this manufacturing capacity, right? And they've been growing at speeds between 8 and 15% during that time, with an incredible investment from the domestic banking system. I mean, Chinese solar manufacturers have been lent something like $50 billion for manufacturing expansion. So unless we're willing to kind of replicate that and give it 30 years, there's no short-term alternative. It's going to take us a very long time.
So next I have from Claudia LaRue a very interesting question. What about the Paris Agreement? Like, how do you think the COP negotiations will play out moving forward after this crisis?
I have no idea. I mean, I think that's a hard one. I think there's just so much movement. On the one hand, I could see this sort of as a shared experience that we've all gone through, one that's highlighted the importance of believing in science and acting on it early, and sort of a renewed sense of urgency of getting together. Looking at how governments are scrambling over masks and kind of diverting shipments from each other, and sort of the table manners that are coming out in responding to this urgent situation. I could also see the opposite happening, that there's sort of a renewed focus on domestic growth at the expense of global collaboration on these issues.
And next from Atul Arya, I have a very interesting question on ESG. So this kind of sustainable finance, ESG investing. Do you think this is going to be a kind of a trend moving forward, given how poorly the energy sector has done and all that?
I hate to speculate about the future on all of these things. I mean, I think it could go both ways. I don't see why not. Maybe if there is, maybe sort of these stimulus investments could become also sort of have a multiplier effect, attract new kinds of firms into the sector, or new investment opportunities for ESG investments. So there could be sort of an amplifier effect. If we can show that these things are working and that we're willing to sort of create long-term frameworks that will succeed in this space.
So
like this, I guess what I'm talking about is the sort of regulatory environment, right? Like if we really shift to a kind of an emissions reductions regulatory framework more consistently around the world, then yes, then it might work.
Got it. Okay, so next I have Vikram Nehru, our colleague, is asking also a very relevant question on this issue of deglobalization. So is this, in your view, is this something that kind of we need to avoid specifically for clean technology, or is there a kind of a broader need to try to protect globalization and to avoid a kind of a cost increase in manufacturing for all sectors?
I think places have fared differently under globalization, and I'm not trying to sort of minimize the economic impact it's had on big parts of the United States where manufacturing disappeared. I think the way to deal with that is across the board, and sort of the threat from just pushing away from globalization is that we're not thinking about constructive solutions for these places, right? So blaming China isn't going to bring manufacturing back to Ohio. What might bring manufacturing back to Ohio are really smart economic policies, which are helping firms in Ohio also participate in globalization, right? And so I think that's the sort of example that we can hopefully set in the clean tech space that might then also give us some ideas for other industries. So, but I don't think, anti-globalization in and of itself is kind of an economic policy that's going to help those that have been hurt.
Got it. Okay. And next, let's take this idea that you had on kind of how different countries could promote manufacturing. Let's make it concrete. So Takiara is asking about, should India, for example, now start promoting domestic manufacturing of solar modules? Has this become a more appealing and exciting idea now compared to where we were just a year ago?
I mean, there's already probably overcapacity in the space, right? Chinese firms have been incredibly good at doing it. They have huge research and development teams that do it. And so I think that we need to be very careful. I mean, we also want to create growth, right? So we can invest a lot in now replicating solar manufacturing infrastructure in India, but is that going to be successful? Can it compete against Chinese firms? And so, I mean, I'm just sort of skeptical that we can do it for the technologies that exist today. That might be completely different. I don't think this division of labor is fixed. So maybe for thin film, for the next generation of clean technologies that are coming, there might be very different space. So I would encourage India to figure out how to get into the next thing rather than compete with China on silicon solar panels that they've really perfected to the point where it's really hard for other technologies to push into the sector.
Perfect. Now, I want to go back to the issue of collaborating with China. So let's say we can actually get some collaboration going. What should it look like? What are the key outcomes that you think we should be looking for?
I think that, part of it is going back to sort of a system that we had. If you think about renewable energy industries in particular, these are sort of the first post-globalization industries, right? They've really sprung up sort of after China had joined the WTO. And so from the beginning, they were incredibly integrated globally. What's happened over the last couple of years is sort of a push against that. And so I think reversing that would be the first step. Let's get back to, we've had great government programs promoting clean tech R&D, joint clean tech R&D between US and Chinese research institutes. I think that's something we could keep doing and use it for collaboration in other ways. Let's get rid of the tariffs, which haven't really helped anyone. They've just sort of, artificially shifted around supply chains around the world in ways that was expensive and hasn't really benefited anyone. And contrary to what our president says, we are paying for those tariffs. So, I mean, those are sort of simple things. I think we could also do a much better job at communicating where jobs actually come from and how they're spread. And so there's not a lot of employment in these solar factories, but there might be much more employment in installation and maintenance in the US in ways that we haven't really highlighted very successfully in public debates. And then I think the final thing that we've not done very successfully is help firms engage China in more productive ways. How can we create legal frameworks so that startups, tech startups that are coming out of US research institutes, the sort of thing that we're incredibly good at, can work with Chinese partners to commercialize their technologies in ways that is not harmful to them. And so, there's a role for government in helping create a kind of an infrastructure and a sort of support system for the things that we're good at and helping them engage with Chinese partners. I think that's much easier for, say, GM or GE or DuPont even. I mean, these multinational firms that can do this sort of stuff in-house. But if the unique contribution to the clean tech space is innovation in the US and sort of small startups coming out of universities, I think they deserve a lot more support in engaging China.
Great. We are approaching the end of our time, but I want to take one more question. And I have a very important kind of broad question from Daniel Kerr, who's asking, Globalization, on the other hand, is what gives us all these supply chains and clean tech and access to innovation that can help us. At the same time, it's also a major source of emissions and a kind of contributor to unsustainable transportation practices and all that. So how do we balance this? How do we create a more sustainable and kind of better globalization?
I mean, one way would be to use globalization strategically to reduce emissions. I mean, you know, push the industries that are already there. I think I've talked about that at length. You know, I don't think that globalization has been the, I mean, I would sort of push back against the question a little bit. I don't think globalization itself is the cause of rising emissions. If you look at energy intensity of the economy, and that's gone down, we've just grown the economies a lot. Let's use globalization to share best practices and sort of communicate about how to do things. There are lots of great ideas out there. I think some countries are a lot further ahead than others in implementing them. And so there's sort of a non-economic globalization of, you know, ideas and approaches that I think we can use to spread those around the world, and also to kind of create development opportunities that are not replicating the sort of emissions path that the advanced industrialized economies have taken.
Okay, perfect. So we still have a long list of questions. Unfortunately, we are not going to get through everything. I was trying to take those that are directly relevant to your expertise to avoid speculation. So I'd like to thank all of the attendees for attending. This was terrific, really, really exciting discussion and interesting questions. And of course, Professor Nam for an outstanding presentation and taking all these difficult questions with a good attitude. Please do follow us at size-isep.org and at size.jhu.edu/campus-events. We have many similar activities coming in the next month or so. So I hope that I can see all of you there and we can continue this discussion. This presentation, both the slides and the recording, will be available for you. So after this webinar, we will send you a link where you can download all the materials that we've had today. So thanks again for joining, and I wish you all a good and healthy day. Bye-bye.